What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you an updated meta-analysis for the February 2018 format. YCS Atlanta just concluded this past weekend, and this is a really big deal because this event is going to set the precedence for how the rest of the meta is going to shape up as we move forward into this format. And with YCS Bochum coming up this upcoming weekend and the UDS Invitational taking place in Sacramento, California here in the States, there's a lot to discuss here. But before we get into that, I want to give a big shout out to my newest patrons as always. So today a big shout out to Sagnick. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So here's the pie chart, which is the top 32 breakdown of YCS Atlanta. And as you can see, there's a lot going on here. So let's start with the biggest elephant in the room, and that's the fact that Pendulum Magician took up 17 of the top 32 slots. Is this surprising? Not really, because myself and a lot of people were predicting Pendulum Magician to be the best deck of this format. What it really boiled down to is how much of an impact was it going to have in the format, how much of an impact was Heavy Metal Foes Electromite going to have, and as we can see by this chart, it obviously has made its mark. Pendulum Magician has now solidified itself as the deck to beat moving into this format. The cool thing about this is, though, there's a lot of different takes and variety in how Pendulum Magician chose to manifest itself. I mean, there's iterations taking advantage of the Mythical Beast engine for extra special summons, potentially even extra draws as well. Kind of a very combo-centric oriented build, but then there's also builds just taking advantage of good old Duelist Alliance and the Pendulum Graphs, just so they can establish Time Pendulum Graph as an extra form of disruption, in addition to their Odd Eyes Vortex, maybe their Naruto, whatever else they're going to summon to help disrupt their opponent during their turn. There's a lot of cool different ways you can approach this deck, and I think that's the most interesting aspect when it comes to Pendulum Magician as a whole here, is kind of figuring out what the best build of the deck is right now, because I think that's still the question. I think people are trying to figure out, you know, obviously Heavy Metal Foes Electromite is an extremely powerful card, but do people want to run cards like Allure of Darkness? Is the Mythical Beast engine superior? Are the Pendulum Graphs superior? Dark Worm, I think, has probably solidified itself as a staple at this point because it's a cheap, easy +1, basically a replacement for Skullcrobat Joker in a sense, so I think that's definitely going to be staple, but I'm really curious to see kind of how the Pendulum Magician meta evolves in and of itself. But the interesting thing about this in the pie chart as well is that now that Pendulum Magician has solidified itself as the best deck, this is a little bit interesting because what's going to happen is I think people are now going to either play Pendulum Magician itself because it has basically established itself as the best deck, or they're basically going to tailor their other strategies, which we can see in the other half of the pie chart, as these decks to beat Pendulum Magician. Now, that's good and bad for a couple reasons, and I know Farfa touched on these reasons as well, but I was thinking the same thing. The issue with this is the fact that it's not exactly like a triangle meta or anything like that. It's more so play Pendulum Magician or play a deck to beat Pendulum Magician, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, the issue is the fact that since Pendulum Magician is the best deck, and there's so many cards that are specifically targeted as hate cards towards Pendulum Magician, specifically cards like Dimensional Barrier, Anti-Spell Fragrance specifically, these cards create an unhealthy environment because by these cards existing in the metagame, they make it so that they deter other decks from being able to be played as well. Spell-centric strategies that basically just flat out lose the Dimensional Barrier as a whole, they're kind of decks that are not really going to be seeing a lot of play because you're not going to want to lose to something that's going to be anti-meta, but at the same time you need to build a deck that's going to beat the meta, which is primarily Pendulum Magician. So there's a little bit of, you know, this conundrum here when it comes to deck building, and it's a little bit unhealthy, but not too much to the extent that the format is just completely shattered. There's a ton of diversity in other decks that have potential, and those are the other things I wanted to discuss. Trickstar took the next highest representation at 5 slots, and to be perfectly honest, I was not expecting it to take that many slots. Trickstar, as I said before, I feel like once Trickstar is in an established meta, it can figure out what cards it needs to play to help combat the meta, and that's where Trickstar starts to shine. We saw that with Spiral last format, and I think we're going to start to see that again. So the fact that Trickstar took 5 top slots is still really good. Now, it still has the Draw and Lock combo at full potential, so that could also contribute to its win as well, but at the same time, The deck is very well rounded, it's very consistent. It's why I had the deck as my second best deck of this format leading into it. So I think it actually overperformed by my expectations at the very least. And I think now that we see Pendulum Magician in the forefront, I think people are going to start adapting their Trickstar strategies to beat Pendulum Magician, and we're going to start seeing some more Trickstar emerge from that as well. Now that takes us on to Invoked, which actually had the next highest representation. There was two or three Invoked decks that made the top 32. And Invoked's really interesting because it's a very strong go second strategy as well as going first. It's a very consistent one card engine. And again, very similarly to Trickstar, it's a deck that can kind of mold itself to any given format. And again, now that we've seen Trickstar establish itself as the best deck, or excuse me, Pendulum Magician establish itself as the best deck, I think we're going to start to see more Invoked decks that are maybe tailored towards going second to kind of combat the boards that Pendulum Magician is capable of creating. Maybe we're going to start seeing a ton of hand traps being played as well, just so you can stop that initial Electromite, establish your Makaba, and then go off from there. But again, there's that issue that because Dimensional Barriers in the format, Barrier is a very strong card versus your Invoked matchup, denying their ability to go into Makaba. So again, this is kind of where that conundrum comes up is, do you want to play a deck that's going to lose a Dimensional Barrier? Because at this point, everyone's going to probably be playing Dimensional Barrier either in the main or side to combat Pendulum Magician because there isn't really a solid answer for Dimensional Barrier at the given moment. Now this leads us on to our next decks, which are True Draco, and then also Lightsworn Zombie Dinosaur, which each took 2 slots in the top 32 as well. True Draco actually underperformed by a long shot in my book, because when I was looking at the meta before YCS Atlanta, True Draco was everywhere on the regional scene, and maybe people took notice of that and prepared for Draco, but at the same time, Draco is incredibly strong going second against Pendulum Magician, thanks to the fact that, you know, you can just set the trap, tribute it, and you can basically just start popping off your opponent's monsters left and right. Even with their disruptions, they really can't play around that too difficult. And even if you play a go first variant, you can play cards like Monarch's Erupt, you can play Anti-Spell Fragrance, you can play Unending Nightmare, you can play all the degenerate floodgates that actually combat Pendulum Magician, and Masterpiece is no fucking joke. So I think this deck incredibly underperformed. I thought Draco and Trickstar were going to be flipped on this meta chart, but it's actually the complete opposite. So I was really surprised to see that. Does that mean Draco is bad? Absolutely not. I think Draco is still a strong strategy people should consider moving forward, and it's definitely something that you shouldn't discount just because it didn't have the best showing at YCS Atlanta. And then we have 60 card Lightsworn Zombie Dinosaur, a new take on a 60 card build, incorporating some of the dinosaur cards. And this is cool because Oviraptor is still an incredibly good starter. You've got Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, which, as we said, is one of the strongest boss monsters in this game and can pretty much just wreck anything in its path. Double Evolution Pill is great in a graveyard-centric deck because you basically have all the resources already. If you hit something with Quoteless and you can add the Evolution Pill, that's just another layer of your attacks that you're going to have that your opponent's going to have to deal with in the form of something like Ultimate Conductor Tyranno. I said 60 card decks, basically Lightsworn Shiranui, but this is basically the same thing just with dinosaurs. I said this deck was going to do well. It managed to get a couple spots, so it would underperform by my expectations, but at the same time, 60 card decks are still definitely a thing, and we're going to touch on that a little bit more here in a little bit. Wrapping everything up, we also had an ABC deck, a Metal Foe Draco deck, and then we also had a Spiral deck in the top cut as well. ABC is still an incredible strategy as well. It can play very well going first or second. It's kind of a very well-rounded deck as a whole, and it was one of my honorable mentions in my top 5 meta decks of the format. So again, ABC is still something you have to contend with. Metal Foe Draco did take first place at a regional before YCS Atlanta, and it looks like one managed to scrape its way into the top cut as well. So again, just another take, actually taking use of Electromite, I guess, in its home deck, if you want to look at it that way. So that's pretty cool. And last but not least, Spiral. So Spiral managed to make 4th place, as a matter of fact, all the way to the top 4, and that's actually a really big deal. A lot of people thought Spiral was dead, and by representation, it is, but it's still an incredibly strong deck nonetheless. It still has tough agent, Double Helix is amazing, and because people aren't playing hand traps as much, and Ash Blossom specifically essentially is in decline, that means your double helix is much more likely to resolve, and the deck is still incredibly explosive. It's just not the powerhouse that it was before. So again, 4th place is still very, very good, only for being the lone spiral in the top 32. Now, one other thing I did want to talk about is that there was a tournament in Berlin that was about 140 players, and this is really a big deal because Bochum YCS is coming up this weekend, so a lot of the players at that tournament were probably testing in anticipation for YCS Bochum this coming weekend. And in the top 8 of that tournament, there was 3 60-card Lightsworn Shiranui, 2 Pendulum Magician, I believe a Paleo, a True Draco, as well as I think an ABC as well. So you can see over in Europe, the results are actually a little bit different from a rather large tournament of this scale, especially leading up to an event like Bochum that's in the same country. These are probably a lot of the players that are going to attend Bochum, and the fact that 3 60-card Lightsworn Shiranui variants managed to make the top cut is a really big deal. Now, obviously, the European meta is maybe slightly different than ours, but I think with Pendulum Magicians setting the precedent for this meta, we've already seen Heavy Metal Foes Electromagnet get bought out. It's increased basically 25 to 50% in price since the event. I think it's definitely the deck to beat moving into this format, but there's still so much room for diversity in terms of what decks you can potentially play, because even though there's one deck taking up about 50% of the meta, look how many other decks still manage to top. And on day 2 of YCS Atlanta, there were still decks like Mech Knight Invoked in contention. There was a DDD deck in contention, Gem Knight FDK, Shadal Dinosaur. These were all decks that were barely just one win away from potentially making the top cut, and they were just right there on the fringe, but just didn't make it at the end. There's a lot of room for creativity and innovation right now, even though we have Pendulum Magician established as the best deck, but now people can tailor those strategies to help combat this deck and start seeing a lot more success. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this meta analysis moving forward, and what you think we might see moving into YCS Bochum. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.